can't see the future. There's nothing but glass in my crystal ball. And if you'd have asked, I'd have told you I'd passed on my last chance to fall in love.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is February 15th, 2018, and this is episode 73. Politicos is not edge of the seat exciting, but we're exceptionally well informed. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicos.
I'm Scott Delaneboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. This week's intro music is Unmade by Ian Cromwell. Cromwell's actually the person who helped connect us with the local bands you've been hearing for the last few weeks. And this song you're hearing right now has been entered for the CBC Music Searchlight competition. So as a favor to him, because he's letting us use this song as a favor, you can go vote for that song every day until February 28th. Visit cbcmusic.ca/searchlight/4936, and that link will be in the description. On today's show, we dissect the BC NDP throne speech, the Kelowna West by-election. Micah gives us an update on the Vancouver Aquarium's lawsuit against the Parks Board, where he admits he's wrong. And we have a roundup of quick takes and the best of BC Poly. But first, we have to thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Teds and Blake Hodson, for helping make this show possible. And we have a new announcement. We have a new partnership. Politicos is now in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's brand new daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. We signed up for this a few days ago, and we've been seeing this daily newsletter of literally just that, well-written, what you need to know about what's going on in BC, from Shannon Waters, a reporter who's over in Victoria, and this is published by Alison Smith, who's launched Queen's Park Today a few months ago, and that's actually been doing really well. So sign up today for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos will receive 25% off subscriptions when you enter the offer code Politicos, all lowercase letters, when you sign up for a free 2-week trial of BC Today newsletter. For that free 2-week trial, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. bctoday.ca is the wrong website. britishcolumbiatoday.ca.
I'll jump into our first segment, an affordable throne. So this week, the legislature resumed in Victoria, and Tuesday was the throne speech.
But first, we got a prorogation because outside of Ottawa, prorogations aren't controversial because we didn't have Stephen Harper ruin it for everyone. It's actually been weird at the federal level. We have talked about prorogation a couple times about how, maybe Trudeau will prorogue over the summer and just give his government a reset. John Horgan's government has sat for a couple months, really, and has already hit the prorogation button, killing, really just all of Andrew Weaver's private members' bills, because they actually did manage to get through the few pieces of legislation in the fall. But I think they're just using this as a chance to set their full agenda. The fall was really that, we're government, what do we do? And now, what are they going to do?
It's mostly what we were expecting out of here. I don't think there were any real big surprises. Few things were notably missing, but overall, it's more or less what the government telegraphed.
The first few sections are all about affordability, and that's what Horgan ran on, so it's not surprising. And the biggest thing to come up first in affordability is housing. I think if it wasn't, we'd be wondering why. And the, quote, first step must be to address demand. So Horgan's planning on taking action on speculation. He wants to make sure people seeking to profit off the out-of-control real estate market are contributing. And there'll be some measures in the budget. We don't know what those are. Probably expanding foreign buyers tax, maybe a speculation type tax to make sure you can't just flip a home in a couple months.
Yeah, we could see something like that, or the BC Housing Affordability Fund that we had Tom Davidoff on to talk about. It's a few different things like that could be done. Maybe changing some of the rules around residential ownership, like whether or not it can be held within a corporation. You could be looking at something like, oh, hey, you can only own residential land in a corporation if you're developing or renting or something like that. You could see stuff like that. And this makes sense as something to put high up on the provincial government's list, just because most of those were going to clamp down on speculation and demand measures or provincial areas of responsibility rather than cities, which are much more limited in what they can do there.
Well, and they also put in their legislation to crack down on tax fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. I think one of the things we've seen a bit more of with the revelations coming out of the Attorney General's office is these casino scams and all these other things, and they all come back to real estate at some point just because there's so much money flowing through Metro Vancouver real estate. So I'm not a tax fraud expert, so I don't know what you do about that, but they're obviously thinking about it at least.
And then on the flip side, they're also looking at building the homes people need. So ran through the accomplishments of building 2,000 new modular homes and 1,700 new affordable rental units that were approved, not necessarily built, but approved, which can sometimes be half the battle.
They play up the largest investment several times throughout this throne speech. The word largest appears 4 times. One of them is just, it's our largest industry is forestry. The other 3 are, we're going to make the largest investment. The first largest investment is going to be in affordable housing in BC's history.
Usually when governments are making investments, it's the largest when you talk about it in nominal terms, just because inflation and economy throw. So I wouldn't read too much into the quote unquote largest.
It does highlight the spending that's going to be happening under this at least. But on that, getting more houses out there, they talked a bit in there as well about bringing down barriers, about allowing local governments to plan for affordable rental housings by just zoning. So it's never too clear in a throne speech. Each policy announcement is like a sentence if you're lucky. And so there's a sentence in here about working with local governments to plan and build housing near transit corridors and having these rental zoning areas. Yeah,
so currently under the BC Municipalities Act and the Vancouver Charter, cities can't actually zone by tenure. So this would change that in theory to allow the cities to designate certain lots as rental-only zones. And there's some intriguing possibilities there, but I could also see it being very badly done and basically just blocking off the already low-income areas, making it so that push all the new development onto there or get economically segregate stuff if it's done badly. And you don't want to create a situation where if you do want to buy, you have to leave the neighborhood. So there's a bunch of potential problems with that, but I could also see it being quite useful if, say, applied very strategically around, say, transit hubs to, improve transit-oriented development and a few things like that.
Yeah, I could see this having that negative effect if your goal is, let's let people zone for rentals. The legislation would probably have to be in such a way that people could therefore zone for not rentals if you had some city that, for whatever reason, didn't like renters. And
I like to see Derek Torridon doing that.
Yeah, or some of the suburbs would just be like, it's nicer to have permanent families and build a neighborhood, whatever code language they want to use.
Character, I believe, is the term of art.
There you go. It's the double edge of any policy, so the devil will be in the details when that eventually comes down. The other thing they propose in here is a housing hub as a section of BC Housing, which will partner with all kinds of groups that are trying to work on social housing developments. So they cite faith organization, nonprofits, and others, basically who just have land lying around. Like there's a number of churches in downtown Vancouver that are realizing that a good way to make a bunch of money is to put a skyscraper right behind your church. You can also fulfill some of your social mission by dedicating a certain amount of it to social housing, but you can also make $1 billion for your church.
Yeah, so there's some non-profits in the city here that do that sort of thing. There's one called, I think, Catalyst, that basically does kind of the development end of the kind of project management, whatnot, of the partnership with nonprofit that happens to own some land to build below market housing. So, this kind of sounds like that, but done via the government's BC Housing.
And then in the rental side of it, they talk about reiterating the same points: more student housing. They want to put money into some of the low-income renter grants that are out there for seniors or low-income families.
Interestingly, the renters grant that featured prominently in their campaign didn't get a mention here. That's the $400 that they were going to give everyone who rents.
That the BC Greens really didn't like.
Yes.
The government will, though, consider future measures to make renting more affordable. So they leave the door open to literally anything else. But the second time they use the phrase largest investment is for retrofits in social housing, which is probably long overdue, although this is the largest investment in more than 20 years. So did the previous BC NDP government make a giant investment in social housing and they're not going to match that? And carrying on the largest investment goal is the childcare section, which closes off their affordability. They want to make the largest investment in childcare in BC. They highlight some of the steps they're already taking, but don't really paint the path to the $10 a day childcare yet. They talk about converting unlicensed spaces to licensed spaces and opening up more licensed spaces and helping people have more information about unlawful and unlicensed spaces and training more early childhood educators, which all seems like good steps, but doesn't really say, and now we will have a childcare program that provides $10 a day. And that was a decade plan, essentially, but you got to start somewhere to get there. The next section they go into is the economic opportunity for people, the economy, essentially. They highlight a lot of the things they've already done or are moving towards: the $15 minimum wage, the Human Rights Commission, reviewing the labor code, etc., etc. And then there's a mention of the Innovation Commissioner, which they note is an initiative of the BC Green Caucus. Like, hey, this is that idea that Weaver's really big on. And it's like, okay, here you go. And if it sucks, it's your fault.
Yeah, that's either if this turns out to be a giant boondoggle, it's, someone else's thing that we're just kind of have to do, or I've kind of pissed off the Greens on Site C or something, so we'll throw them a bone. Like, it could be either one or both, probably both.
And then they talk about a lot of new post-secondary spaces. So 2,900 new tech-related spaces in college and universities, the first software engineering program in the interior, and opening up a engineering degree program in northern BC, which I have to assume is at UNBC. And then they move into reconciliation, talking about developing a cross-ministry framework to meet UNDRIP, Truth and Reconciliation, and the Silkwatan decision. And there's also an important note in there, I think, that they want to make sure the government pays attention to Indigenous people living on or off reserves, because a lot of these times the government will try to work nation to nation, as they should be doing, but that doesn't necessarily help Indigenous people living in the city of Vancouver who don't necessarily identify with a formal reserve or nation. And so those can be the people who fall through the cracks a lot of the time. And they also reference new measures that are going to come out to support Indigenous peoples, languages, and cultures. I know the Museum of Anthropology and the Royal BC Museum have been doing some great work trying to preserve Indigenous languages. So hopefully there'll be at least some funding to build those programs up, because with 200 plus nations in this province, that's a lot of languages that not a lot of people speak in a lot of time. And one interesting thing I learned a couple weeks ago is one project Sam Sullivan does on his spare time is try to resurrect the Chinook Wawa language, which wasn't an Indigenous language. It was the language briefly used between the 1850s and about 1920s for the Indigenous English and French colonists to all sort of jargony speak together. And when I was at Fort Langley the other day, they told me one of the ways to say hello is Klahaya, which is short for Clark, how are you? As in Lewis and Clark.
Interesting.
I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but it's one of those jargon languages of mashup. And Sam Sullivan on the Last Vancouver is Awesome podcast talked about that.
He has some interesting projects on the go.
We'll get him around eventually on the show.
So, next section with services for people. Under healthcare, saw talk of reduced surgical wait times, increasing time caregivers spend with seniors, more support for families and to train more people, as well as some new hospitals and revitalized facilities. But pretty sparse on what the details are of that. I'm sure we'll see it this coming Tuesday in the budget. Then on to education, bringing on 3,500 new teachers, librarians, and counselors. They're going to build some schools, as well as do the very important seismic upgrades that are needed on far too many schools. They named 50 in here.
They put the number 50, and they said they've already announced funding for 13 schools. The other thing they talk about in education is how too many parents are having to fundraise for every little thing that their school needs. So they're going to create a new playground capital fund, which will hopefully stop parents from having to run bake sales so their kids can have a new playground. And that probably is actually going to be a fairly cheap thing. A lot of these playgrounds aren't that expensive to replace. And
well, if you could do it with bake sales, it probably isn't that expensive.
Yeah. Meanwhile, it's going to build you a lot of social capital among people and parents who just want to have nice playgrounds for their kids. So I think that's just a pretty good idea. And then they're also going to try and do some reviews around funding for schools in the rural and northern communities. You know, there's got to be those SOPs to the interior where the BC NDP has few MLAs at the moment. Public safety comes next, and that's mostly focused on all of the cannabis legislation that'll have to be brought in, as well as continuing to fight gang and gun violence. And then we get into infrastructure. Yeah,
so the big project I got to mention was the Patello Bridge was in very bad need of replacement. Basically has at most 5 years left on its service life. And interestingly, the government put out a press advisory that they were going to do a big announcement tomorrow morning in New Westminster.
In other words, by the time you're listening to this, there will be news about the Patello Bridge replacement, probably.
Yes, and the government's communication people really need to step up their game, because if they want us to talk about this stuff, you can't put it on a Friday.
Well, apparently they don't want people to talk about the Patello Bridge, because that's why you release things on a Friday, is to bury it.
Well, that, and like I remember back when they first came into power, they do all their announcements on a Friday for like a good 2 months. It was really irritating for us. But yeah, something will be happening. It's probably going to be a new bridge, like that they're going to get working on right away. The big question that I want to answer to is how they're going to pay for it, because since there are no more tolls on bridges, that was kind of the thing that was going to pay for the Patello Bridge replacement. So, you know, how are they getting the money now? And I'm sure we'll find out tomorrow. Or you will have already found out by the time you're listening.
They also talk about working with the Mayor's Council to expand rapid transit and reviewing BC ferries. Things that aren't surprises to anyone that's been following the BC NDP's rhetoric for the last few years.
The one interesting phrase in there is working with the Mayor's Council on rapid transit, which might signal they're not as fond of the congestion pricing initiative pushed by the Mayor's Council, but we'll see.
And finally, in the climate and environment section, they promise a new climate plan to come. The Liberals had received a climate leadership plan, I think in about 2015, early 2016, and it basically urged them to get back on track with the carbon taxes Gordon Campbell had put in and start raising it again and start finding ways to meet our carbon targets. And I think that was pretty well received. But then we didn't do half of those things. So I guess now we need a new plan. They want to make sure we can get to our $50 a ton carbon tax by 2022, which is what the federal government has mandated. And also revitalize the environmental assessment process with terms of reference coming in the next few months. So this would potentially be another way to challenge new LNG projects, new pipelines, depending on how you want to frame this process. Finally, they mentioned diluted bitumen, which I think a lot of people were expecting to be much firmer or stronger, with the note that there will be protections for spill responses coming in, but we don't know when or what those look like. And some people thought the language looked a little softer than some of Horgan's previous rhetoric against the government of Alberta. And some people said, well, it's still in there. You're reading tea leaves at this point with the throne speech.
Yeah, so that's basically what we can expect over the next legislative session. Yeah, more or less, not much of a surprise in there.
Yeah, overall, it hits a lot of what the NDP campaigned on. They talked about affordability and pitching these kind of measures around child care, around housing. A lot of the speech that we didn't go into thoroughly was just reviewing the things, all those low-hanging fruit they hit in the first 4 or 5 months of office, of abolishing the tolls and other things that they pitched as affordability efforts. And since they're only a few months out of taking office, if they'd brought in a bunch of new things, it looked kind of bad. It looked like they're changing course or pulling policy out of nowhere. Overall, it doesn't look like they've really gone back on a lot that they campaigned on, which is something they could have done. They could have abandoned a bunch of things. The $10 a day childcare is somewhat missing out of here, but we know Andrew Weaver doesn't like that anyway. So finding out how to pay for that when you have an uncooperative partner might have been part of the problem. But realistically, I don't see Andrew Weaver bringing the government down over this.
No. Andrew Weaver is not going to bring the government down until November at the absolute earliest. It's just not going to happen.
But there was a bit of news on the other side of the aisle where Andrew Wilkinson, after taking control of the BC Liberals, has started to shuffle up his leadership team. And he has decided that Rich Coleman, after serving as interim leader, could maybe spend some time in the backbench, as well as fellow leadership contender and the person he signed a "your people vote for me second and all my people vote for you second" deal, Mike DeYoung, has no portfolio after being House Leader.
Yeah, that's the one that really stands out as a, what happened there moment. Because, yeah, you figured after that cooperation in the leadership race, they'd will have had each other's back after that, too.
I think the most surprising thing would have been if Todd Stone was suddenly House Leader. I think most of the people have kept their same roles that they had before the leadership race. And so Todd Stone is wherever he was before. But yeah, Mike DeYoung, I don't know what he did to upset Andrew Wilkinson. One of the other leadership candidates, though, Michael Lee, did get the Critic of the Attorney General role. And Mary Polak, the former Environment Minister, I believe, is now the Liberals' House Leader. I wonder if one of his motivations here was to bring more women to the front. On his leadership team, his sort of internal leadership team, like his chief of staff and his leader of the opposition office, he brought in a couple of women like Rebecca Scott, who worked on his campaign, and Jennifer Chalmers, who is also a Christy Clark staffer. And so maybe putting Mary Polak as a way to feature women, because one of the things that was in his platform was that commitment to gender diversity, Me Too stuff.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility.
For our second segment, that was literally the same result. The Kelowna West by-election happened yesterday with almost within 2 percentage points, everyone getting literally the same result as the 2017 election. The Liberals, under Ben Stewart rather than Christy Clark, got 56.5% instead of 59%, so they lost a little bit. But otherwise, the NDP's Shelley Cook went from 25% down to 23.5%. The Greens went from 13.7% to 12.7%. And the Conservatives actually picked up 6.6%, which was literally the only interesting thing about this result. The turnout went down to about 29%. So if you look at the raw vote totals, which is how I usually try to judge a by-election, like, did people keep their votes or did like another party show up? All that literally happened was half the voters showed up for everyone equally.
Yeah, there's almost really nothing to talk about here. It was a safe Liberal seat before the by-election. It stayed a safe Liberal seat. Nothing very interesting happened.
It shows at least that voters are content or in the same position as they were in May, which probably gives the Greens a lot of pause. I think the Greens, at least on Twitter, were very excited about this by-election. I think they were in their wildest dreams would win, but realistically hoping to take second place. To not see any gain on the NDP on this is a setback for them, where the Okanagan and the hippies and the growing young professional set of Kelowna and Vernon were, I think, one of their hopes for expanding into the interior. It shows they've held on to the gains they've made in the past few years, because the Greens getting 13% in the pretty conservative Kelowna West is an accomplishment for them. But if it's not continuing to pick up, it's got to be a little disheartening at least.
Yeah, it's in theory they could have made some gains, but it's a by-election. I don't think, and nobody's really upset with the status quo very much, any more than they were before. So, honestly, there's just not much here.
I do legitimately find it amusing that the Conservatives can put Mark Thompson, someone I think we mentioned, but I blank on who he was or literally anything about him, but he can still get 900 votes out of the number who showed up and pull in 6.5% of the vote just by having that blue flag behind him, which, if I'm Andrew Wilkinson, might make me worried for some of the more marginal seats. Like, you're not going to lose Kelowna West because of that, but some of the Fraser Valley seats, like this is how Chilliwack went NDP one time, is you had a strong Conservative vote come through. And hey, as we've said multiple times, the BC Conservatives are a party ripe for an easy takeover. If anyone out there is ambitious and wants to stir some trouble up in this province, you can probably run that party pretty quickly.
Yeah, although they have at least improved upon the dismal website they had before. It's now not entirely terrible. But yeah, they are ripe for a takeover.
It's not exactly the strong signal of strength that I think Andrew Wilkinson tried to play it off as, but a win's a win, and having another BC Liberal butt in a chair does give them the vote. That makes life a bit tougher for John Horgan and the BC NDP.
And moving on to our third segment, Micah was wrong. So the Parks Board versus BC Aquarium case was decided this week, and Micah's on to share a few thoughts on what happened and why his predictions were off.
Bush and Scott, it's a pleasure to be invited back on the program. Thank you for bringing me back on. I'm going to jump right into it today because there's a lot to discuss here. To introduce this segment, I'm going to take the half dozen of you still paying attention at this point back to May 15th, 2017. The Park Board decides at that point to prohibit the keeping of cetaceans in Vancouver parks by passing a bylaw. Cetaceans are creatures such as dolphins, whales, and porpoises. The Vancouver Aquarium, for its part, is furious. To give you some context, in the early 2000s, the aquarium planned a major expansion of the aquarium. The estimated cost was $100 million. The heart of the plan was to provide new and larger facilities for cetaceans, including beluga whales. By the time the Park Board passed the motion banning cetaceans, the aquarium had already invested $45 million into the expansion plan. Of course, the major moneymaker of the aquarium are the cetacean exhibits. So alongside this expansion pad, the aquarium was also upset that it was going to lose the stars of the institution. The aquarium phones up my boy, Randall Hordo, who gathers a dream team, including Jeffrey Gomery, who's a prof at UBC and who was counsel on the Sunripe decisions. The aquarium goes to court and argues that the Park Board's bylaw is unenforceable for a number of reasons. Two of those reasons are that the Park Board's bylaw violates a licensing agreement signed by both the Park Board and the aquarium, and that licensing agreement allowed the aquarium to manage its day-to-day activities. The second, more fascinating reason is that the bylaw infringes the aquarium's freedom of expression. This is a charter argument. This got the attention of the folks at Animal Justice, who decided to intervene on that matter, and who, by the way, have a great podcast called Paw and Order, which you should all check out. Part of the Park Board's response is that the licensing agreement does not fetter the Park Board's ability to pass whatever bylaws it wants. And further, courts ought to show deference to democratically elected decision makers. While the motion materials are filed, arguments are heard in late 2017, but in mid-January, before a decision is ultimately rendered, the aquarium surprisingly announces that it will no longer keep whales and dolphins in captivity. Two of the aquarium's 3 cetaceans also died between May 2017, when the bylaw was passed, and December 2017, leaving Helen the dolphin as the lone survivor. Justice Mayer hears the arguments and splits his decision into 2 issues. First, Mayor needs to figure out whether the park board is even able to fetter or limit its ability to enact bylaws that conflict with agreements, including the licensing agreement, that it enters into. Now, the City of Vancouver and through the City of Vancouver, the park board gets its power through the provincial government and specifically through the Vancouver Charter. And this is important because governing bodies cannot typically tie the hands of future governing bodies. But in the case of municipalities, which, as I mentioned, are created by provinces, if the enacting power provides a method and a purpose for a governing body to fetter its own decision-making powers, as the Vancouver Charter seems to, then the municipal body can fetter its decision-making abilities. And this is what Mayor finds. Despite the park board's clear mandate to control the park, that mandate is not paramount or superior to the park board's lease-making and licensing abilities. There are so many good quotes as Justice Mayer decides this first issue, but paragraph 113 is key, in which Mayer distinguishes between a government, a city, and a municipality, and finds that the park board is none of these. Rather, a park board is more similar to an administrative body which, and I'm going to quote directly from the decision here, may overstep its bounds if it adopts a political position which conflicts with its core mandates. Issue 2 is whether the license agreement between the aquarium and park board actually fetters the park board's decision-making powers. In addition to leasing land to the aquarium to operate the aquarium and allowing the aquarium to control the day-to-day administration, the licensing agreement says that the aquarium is required to abide by the park board's bylaws as they may be enforced from time to time. And the park board jumps on this provision. They say that the license agreement cannot shield the aquarium from policy decisions based in animal welfare and public ethics. After going to the Oxford English Dictionary to define administration, Justice Mayer finds that actually bringing in cetaceans does restrict the day-to-day administration of the aquarium. Further, if the park board is allowed to enforce whatever bylaws it wants, it will render the other elements of the licensing agreement meaningless. It would prevent the aquarium from operating the aquarium as the two parties intended in 1999 when they brokered the licensing agreement in the first place. The only bylaws that can survive the licensing agreement, Justice Mayer decides, are those which do not in pith and substance defeat the purpose of the licensing agreement. As an undercurrent to the entire decision, and this is purely my reading of the reasons, by the way, Justice Mayer seems concerned about the certainty of relationships that the park board enters into. Should the park board be able to simply ignore the contracts that it has entered into, particularly when there are such high levels of vulnerability entirely on one side of these broker deals? Justice Mayer also seems prejudiced against the park board that its concerns do not rise to the level of its provincial and federal cousins. Ultimately, the bylaw is not found to be ultra vires, but it is unenforceable at the aquarium due to the licensing agreement. As a result, the charter question, whether the bylaw infringes the aquarium's freedom of expression, is never heard. Animal Justice decides to spin this as a victory in their press release, I suppose it is. This decision came as a surprise to me, and the amount of egg I've had to take off my face is obscene. Given the high levels of deference given to democratically elected bodies, I didn't see this one coming. But as for an appeal, findings on statutory interpretation are tricky ever since SATVA, since the standard of review has been heightened to a level of palpable and overriding error. Although I disagree with the decision on issue 2 regarding the bylaw's nexus with the day-to-day administration of the aquarium, I can't say that the determination was palpably wrong. Mayer's determination, however, at paragraph 113 regarding the park board's level of deference on decisions grounded on ethical determinations does strike me as a question of law and could be reviewed on a standard of correctness, and the park board may very well want to rehear that issue. Finally, the current license agreement between the park board and the aquarium expires in 2029, so the aquarium might get booted from Stanley Park in 11 years. Maybe the aquarium's self-imposed decision to scrap cetaceans is very far forward-looking, or maybe they are just waiting to see who is elected to the board later this year. I'm not sure. Thanks again for having me back, boys, and look forward to being on the podcast next time.
Moving on to quick takes. This week was open season, I guess, of both starting to make announcements for the upcoming Vancouver municipal election and speculating wildly, as Charlie Smith did in the Georgia Strait by naming literally everyone I think he could think of, from like Joyce Murray to Spencer Chandra Herbert to actual people who are interested. So maybe we'll start with the real people rather than the dream candidates, I guess. The Globe and Mail and a few others were reporting that federal NDP MPs and past MPs, Libby Davies and Don Davies, which everyone made sure to point out are not related, are both possibly mulling a Vancouver mayoral bid. Libby is a bit more left than most of the NDP, and Don is pretty well respected among the establishment NDP. He's got his progressive cred. If either of them ran, they would represent the left half of whatever coalition will eventually come together.
Well, I'm not sure a coalition will come together.
That's true. The Greens can always ruin things, as they will, and Vision...
Well, the Greens are partly progressive.
That's true, and Vision may run Joyce Murray.
Or especially the Vancouver Greens.
So their names are being floated, and they haven't ruled it out. I know there has been a draft Libby Davies campaign for a few weeks, and I guess she's considering it seriously.
Names don't exactly thrill me. It's Libby Davies, former Vancouver councillor, spent a bunch of time in Ottawa. I think Vancouver needs some fresher ideas and faces, and Vancouver of 20, 30 years ago, I just don't see it being it.
But at the city council level, we have a few people seeking council nominations. On the NPA side, Adrian Crook is looking for a nomination.
Yeah, so Adrian Crook of 5 Kids, 1 Condo fame, member of Abundant Housing, announced he intends to seek the NPA's nomination. I know Adrian. I think he'd be a great city councillor, really passionate about the issues and everything. And I think the NPA would be smart to take a look at him very seriously, because the older, more reactionary elements that have come out strong against bike lanes for the last 10 years, it's not a message that's resonated with Vancouver at all, and that demographic is shrinking comparatively each year. And I think if the NPA is going to remain relevant, someone like Adrian Crook is the way to kind of bring them more into the where Vancouver should be and is going.
The other side of the spectrum, I guess, in a way, Ben Bolliger is seeking the nomination for One City's council spot. He's a Vancouver resident since 2008, has been on a few of the active transportation policy councils and things like that. He's also got a degree in poli-sci and First Nation studies, and he's worked with Jack Layton's NDP, so been all over the policy and backroom areas. And I think One City is showing that it might be one of the forces that really steps up, possibly in Vision's collapsing absence and vacuum that it's creating.
I definitely think they are going to make a play for it. I mean, they're yet another Cope splinter.
But Cope is kind of a corpse at this point.
Yes, but you had the first splinter that was Vision, and now the second one is One City, and I think they're aiming to, fill the void that the sinking ship that is Vision is now leaving.
So I'm sure we'll see more names come through in the coming weeks. I'll throw the link to Charlie Smith's piece in the show notes just because it's amusing, at the very least.
Politics does abhor a vacuum, and I think the lack of a clear successor on the left is going to lead quite a few people to throw their hat in the race. And I think that's also that competition for the lack of the clear successor is going to make any coalition or agreement hard to pull off in practice. So the other big news municipally this week was the Vancouver City Council approved the Northeast False Creek Plan, which is going to take out the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts, and instead of a bunch of oddly semi-highway sections that are just kind of hanging out in the middle of the city, it's going to be turned into a new neighborhood, bunch of parkland, bunch of new housing, both market and social housing. It's going to include 20 to 25 towers, 1,800 social housing units that'll house about 3,500 people. There's also part of this is the Hogan's Alley recognition. There's going to be a lot of emphasis put on redressing the past injustices that were done when the predominantly black neighborhood of Hogan's Alley was demolished as part of the ultimately aborted project of building a bunch of freeways through Vancouver. And well, the one neighborhood that wasn't able to stop them was the predominantly black neighborhood of Hogan's Alley, and that's been a somewhat long-standing sore spot among the city's black community.
Yeah, that part of this announcement specifically I want to pause on, since we're in the middle of Black History Month, and we kind of forget that there is, or a lot of people forget that there is a black community in Vancouver, and it's a very diverse one, and it's been here for a long time. People have come from a lot of different places, and Hogan's Alley has been one of those features of, oh, you should at least know that name and know that area. But there's nowhere you can point to. You can't point to like Chinatown or... So the Hogan's Alley thing, I'm really glad to see. There'll be in this plan, which I'll get to the size of it in a minute, $15 million of it is dedicated to promoting the heritage of the area. And they're also going to name this new district using a Coast Salish word that will be done in consultation with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which I think is a great step forward. The scale of this is what's really, I think, worth focusing on. And this is not like a little, oh, here's a couple houses we're approving, or 105 Kiefer, one of these single developments. This is a 20-year plan worth $1.7 billion, essentially. And that budget is what the city is estimating they'll make from development levies and money magically coming from the provincial and federal governments. And that will then be distributed to cover the new parks, the new community facilities, civic facilities, some flood protection because you're right on False Creek there, as well as some childcare and other things, and the expenses of taking the viaducts out and putting new streets in, as well as building a bunch of affordable homes and stuff. So this is a very massive project. And I think that's why there was at least some pushback from the NPA, who ironically voted against a massive development project, because they were wondering, where's this money going to come from?
Yeah, so it's worth pausing to note that the 1.7 billion wasn't 1.7 billion when it was first proposed, and the cost of this has gone up. So there are definitely some reasonable criticisms to be directed at vision around why are the costs going up, and are we actually doing this in a cost-effective manner? And also, I think questions about whether or not this quite a large bit of city land's being leveraged to the most effective way. Like, city land's one of those things that's actually really valuable and can be leveraged in a really good way. And I mean, I'm all for market housing, but if you're going to use city land, maybe it's not the best place to be emphasizing that. And that was kind of Bremner's main point on the housing stuff, is that if you're going to use city land, you might as well target it towards more middle class stuff than the higher end developments.
For scale, this entire development is aimed to fill 10 to 12,000 people. And of those residents, there'd be space for about 3,500 social housing units. So 1 in 4 people in there will be in social housing, and maybe you could get it up to 1 in 3 or a little bit better. So I think that's fair, and I would love to see more. It is a project that needs to go forward. I think this is a section of downtown essentially that's been
it's kind of void between Main Street and downtown. It's not a great part of the city,
and there's not a lot of opportunities that most major cities have sitting right beside their downtown where it's not.
Well, this is basically Vancouver's last brownfield development that it can do in any real scale.
And this isn't one of those ones where you're gentrifying out a bunch of people. There's not actually existing housing there. You have 2 stupid viaducts and a literal empty lot that Concord Pacific has been sitting on for 30 years.
The viaducts are one of those things that's important to touch on because they are seismically unfit to remain in service. And
like so many things in Vancouver.
Yeah, it's actually terrible. Like we need to be putting a lot more resources into upgrading our infrastructure. It would take a significant amount of money to either keep the viaducts and upgrade them or tear them down and build new ones. And that's what Glenn Chernin, who's going after the MPA's mayoral nomination, wants to do. And that's, one of those kind of regressive, let's try and, make Vancouver great again, so to speak, approaches, which, just doesn't make sense, doesn't explain where the money comes from. It's a terrible idea. And so if you're going to have to get rid of the viaducts, you might as well leverage the land. And, Vision, I think, could have done a better job on this one, but at least the land's going to get much better used than just putting up a slightly newer viaduct.
And it's also Vancouver, so we're going to revisit this plan about 6 more times before we ever see a shovel in the ground.
So the most controversial part of this whole thing was 3 of the proposed towers are going to cut into one of the view cones. And there's been some people who've raised a fair bit of stink about this.
So a view cone for those
who aren't in Vancouver.
Get how Vancouver planning works is there are designated...
I don't think anyone really gets Vancouver planning.
There's random designated spots around the city where you have to have pretty views of the mountains. Some of these make sense. Some of them are the middle of bridges or the mayor's house where the mayor doesn't actually live anymore. The idea is to try to maintain the beautiful natural views that we have here of North Shore Mountains and the ocean, which, fine, this is a gorgeous city and you don't want it to look like LA or Toronto or ugly cities. I'm going to get flack.
I actually like a distinctive skyline,
but you can do it in a smart way. And so like you're saying, 3 towers were going up and those cut right in where if you're standing on a certain point, you can now see less mountain.
It's a fairly small little cut out of there. And honestly, it's one of those fights I don't think anyone should be having. It's, on one hand, we're putting housing there and housing is more important than views. But at the same time, this is maybe not the place we should be looking to throw a whole bunch more housing on. It's the kind of probably underlying way that the city's done it for years, is that you force everything into that narrow little downtown area and then leave the vast swaths of the city for slightly denser suburbia.
12,000 people downtown is actually a pretty efficient way to make your city...
Yeah, but what I'm saying is you have all of the single-family neighborhoods that, if you just allowed low-rises in, you could take a huge amount of the housing pressure off. And there's no reason to even talk about needing to cut into the view cones for housing for another 60 years at the earliest. We're looking at the 75% of the land that's reserved for single-family homes. It's an argument we shouldn't be having, and it's, I think, a sign of how badly Vision's done city planning here, is that they're constantly forcing all the development into areas where it doesn't always work well and leaving vast parts of the city untouched.
Well, given that we've spent probably longer talking about this quick take than we spent on the Kelowna by-election, which for some reason we made a full segment, I'm going to pivot and move us on to provincial politics again, where on Friday there was scheduled to be a provincial government and federal government joint press conference to announce some childcare funding. And if you'll recall last week's episode, we talked a lot about this little trade spat that's happening between our province and Alberta right now. Maybe coincidentally enough, maybe they're unconnected events, but the federal government went, oh, we have a scheduling conflict. We can't make it out for this childcare announcement. You still get the money. And so we still get $153 million over 3 years. Trudeau or his ministers didn't want to be pictured with BC and our ministers.
Yeah, so even if someone accidentally screwed up the schedule, if you're rolling out $100 million or more announcement, you find the time to fit it in somewhere. You don't just quietly send the check.
Well, and BC just basically posted it on some back corner of the website being like, and we got $153 million. I'm like, childcare is one of the signature policies of the BC NDP. They clearly felt embarrassed by this announcement cancellation. And Rob Shaw in the Vancouver Sun says, yeah, this is probably what happens when you get into trade spats and the federal government doesn't want to be seen with you and might be a little stingy on those purse strings. But the money still came through, which is what sort of gets me. Maybe it was one of those pre-existing agreements and they weren't going to at least go back on it, but there's this, at least Andrew Wilkinson is trying to raise this, if BC and Alberta don't get over their trade spat, as in the federal government has already taken Alberta's side and saying they want the pipeline through. So if Oregon doesn't back down, BC's going to have a tougher time getting money for transportation and childcare and the other things we're talking about. And maybe we won't be able to afford that Northeast Falls Creek plan like we were just talking about that the federal government is apparently pitching in for. So trade battles are always stupid, as you say. And apparently they're petty when you don't want to be seen taking photos together.
So along that line of tension between the provinces and the federal government, the NEBs decided to grant Kinder Morgan permission to tunnel under Burnaby Mountain.
There was 3 decisions approved today, this afternoon actually, that had been filed by Kinder Morgan to get this pipeline going through, and all 3 got the green light. But as the NEB notes, Kinder Morgan still needs federal, provincial, municipal permits to all go through to really start tunneling. But otherwise, it's starting to move the project forward after a long time. Although I do love that just last week, Trudeau was starting to talk about a new assessment process because the NEB's was so flawed. And here's the NEB still giving green lights. And he's like, well, but we need this pipeline, right? The other thing I saw here is Greenpeace had a nice little line. Ian Anderson, their spokesperson, said about the protests they're inevitably going to start doing, because now we have nice maps of where these tunnels are going to be, that they're in for a Kinder surprise.
Terrible pun.
So 56% of the Trans Mountain Pipeline route has been approved, and we'll have to see how long it takes to finish that other 44%, or if the BC NDP can hold it up in court long enough. The other big announcement out of the provincial government this week was the legislative committee that had been studying rideshare announced its report. This is the pathway that MLAs have been studying on how to get us to services like Lyft and Uber and other ride-sharing apps. And the report sets it out fairly straightforwardly, saying there should be standards across the board. Ride-sharing companies should make efforts to make sure their vehicles are accessible, and if they're not, potentially there's levies faced against them. There should be similar tax regimes across the board. And on a lot of the more controversial things around how much traffic will this increase, how much environmental impact will this have, they basically just say, make them give the government data and we'll figure it out later. So there would have to be reporting of wait times, of how many trips are taken and all that kind of stuff. There's also some calls for ICBC to create either an expanded or a specific kind of insurance for rideshare drivers and just some other protections. Nothing seemed really insurmountable. Andrew Weaver and the Greens jumped on this right away. I think it was notable that it was a consensus report, so the Liberals, Greens, and NDP MLAs all signed off on it. Although the report did note there were like some subtle differences where they didn't all agree, but in the recommendations, they seem pretty...
Yeah, in fact, and most of the partisan sniping I've seen on this has been over timelines more than anything else. So it's... yeah, I mean, nothing really stands out here as terrible or particularly controversial. I'm sure there'll be some people who think it doesn't go far enough and others who, think this is too much of a giveaway. But yeah, overall seems to balance things fairly well.
It even, I think, gives some space for taxis to do better. It notes that if you're going to let Uber pick up in Burnaby and then drive into Vancouver, and then if they can pick up in Vancouver and drive back to Burnaby, then taxis should be allowed the same. Yeah,
it's stupid that those rules exist as it is now.
So at least if this framework comes through, it creates a more level playing field. It still privileges taxis in some ways. Like if you want to pick up off the street, you get a taxi. But a lot of cities have done that around the world that I've seen. And it is a way to make sure you're not being picked up by a random stranger who kidnaps you.
Mm-hmm.
Realistically, there's nothing really stopping them from getting on with it other than literally all those other pieces of legislation that the NDP is eager to get through, particularly around cannabis legalization. But hey, if Andrew Weaver wants to draft up a bill, this could be the one that he gets the BC Liberals to side with, and the NDP now has a path to say, you know what, that's fine. Let's let it go through eventually. Well, and while we're mentioning ways that the legislature can work together, we were sent an announcement that I guess started in December, but is something that I think we'll try and get engaged in, is Daryl Pleckus, who was appointed speaker and then kicked out of the BC Liberal caucus, I guess is trying to find things to do with his time when he's not being speaker. And he's created a speakers forum on the role of members. And what he basically wants to do, it looks like, is bring together all kinds of people from across the province, academics, media, young people, anyone with an interest in our parliamentary democracy, and just talk about how the roles of our MLAs and elected officials can be enhanced and improved. And so he wants to have this framework, have roundtables over the next year, and culminate in reports and recommendations that hopefully someone will read and do something with. But at the very least, it'll be a bunch of discussions about, hey, we have this system, whether or not there's electoral reform will be irrelevant. We'll still have MLAs. How can we make our legislature more healthy? And maybe he feels like he needs to do that because he's still pulling knives out of his back, or in the other members of the BC Liberal caucus, they think they're pulling knives out of their back. But it's honestly sounds like a good thing. And you don't see the speakers usually take on very public roles. They usually sort of make their decisions in the legislature and then are quiet. But this sounds like something Pleckus really wants to get out there and do. And he's accepting emails from the public. So if you want to email speakersforum@ledge.bc.ca, you can add your thoughts, get on his mailing list, and maybe we'll get Daryl on the show to talk up how we can have better MLAs.
Yeah, it seems like a great initiative on his part, and hopefully something good comes of it.
On Friday, the jury came back with the verdict in the trial of Gerald Stanley, who was being charged with the second-degree murder or manslaughter of Colton Bushy, the Indigenous 22-year-old who was shot by Gerald Stanley's gun, at least, on his farm when stuff happened a couple years ago. And we don't need to relitigate the whole case, but the long story short is the jury found him not guilty, I guess buying the accidental firing theory that the defense proposed involving a hang fire and a gun just randomly discharging, as they apparently can do sometimes, maybe.
It's fairly rare. I've fired a lot of rounds and I've never had one. So I don't actually know what the stats are on how rare they are, but it's not common. But that's also kind of beside the point, because the first rule of firearm safety is you never point the firearm at anything you aren't willing to shoot. And even if there was a hang fire, the barrel should not have been pointed anywhere near anyone.
Yeah, a lot of other podcasts have spent a lot of time on this. Media Indigenous episode this week does their take, and the docket does the more legal take, talking about the possible issues as well around preemptory challenges of the jury selection, because that came up a lot because it seemed to be an all-white jury, at least on appearance. And Colton Bushy's survivors, his family, who was there at the jury selection, apparently said the defense just went challenge anytime someone visibly Indigenous was on. So all kinds of issues around that. Following this, Trudeau made some statements on social media, and Jody Wilson-Raybould, the justice minister, saying, we mourn for this. Their government, they obviously can't appropriately challenge a court decision, but they feel like justice wasn't done for his family. They met together early in this week. The family actually was in Ottawa meeting with the minister and the prime minister, I believe. And then Trudeau gave a speech yesterday in the House of Commons on a new framework with Indigenous peoples. So he starts by talking about the Bushy verdict, and he talks about how the justice minister will be doing a review of the justice system and looking at this jury selection process at a very least, and maybe bringing in some of the changes that happened in the US decades ago following racial issues in stereotypical Southern courtrooms, where white juries would convict black people but let off white lynchers So that's probably a promising step forward. Those will have to be interrogated, of course, as they come forward. But the broader thrust of his speech was a new framework, and the meat wasn't really there. But it sounds like, if I want to be charitable to him, he wants to give life to Section 35 of the Charter, the Aboriginal rights and titles, and saying, we don't need to amend that, but we need to proactively recognize the rights of Indigenous people, not just fight them in court all of the time, or have them have to fight in court. So I think the most charitable interpretation is, let's build up a new legislative structure so we can tear up the Racist Indian Act and start to recognize the rights of reserves, rights of Indigenous people off there, and fulfill UNDRIP and all these other things. The thing I've heard the most skepticism over, as with all of the Trudeau promises now, is, so this is going to be an engagement leading to a framework by the end of his mandate in 2019. Will this just be talk?
Yeah, that remains to be seen. And I mean, they've hinted that these sorts of issues are going to feature prominently in the budget. So some of the stuff around clean water on reserves and stuff might be getting funding, or the funding that it should have had a while ago. But it's also the Trudeau government, so it wouldn't be a surprise to see it heavily backloaded into the 2020s for most of that spending.
After Trudeau gave his response, Cathy McLeod, BC MP for the Conservative Party from Merritt, gave her response. And then Romeo Saganash stood up and gave the response for the NDP, and his was powerful. So he started his response in Cree, which they don't translate on Cpac because it's not an official language of this country. But he talked about how he was thanking the Prime Minister for his words and for his commitment and his promises here. But then he went into things like that, how reserves don't have clean drinking water, about how this government has been fighting the human rights tribunals multiple times and has faced multiple compliance orders for not properly funding education of Indigenous children. And it's that, well, you're saying good things here. Thank you. You could also just do these. These are easy, low-hanging fruit that you don't need a national engagement to really do. You could just do what the courts have told you to do. And so it was really good response from him, I thought, that really hit on those tangibles that were missing from Trudeau's speech. This did feel like a big push that he wanted to do. I know Trudeau in the election in 2015 talked a lot about reconciliation. He's done that the whole way through. So maybe this is what he's been building up to. And he obviously didn't write this speech in response to the Stanley verdict, but that just worked in. So maybe it'll be the thrust of the legislation over the next couple of months of how do we change all of these policies and build a new relationship.
And finally, it's been a bit of a wild last 24, 36 hours or whatever in Ontario, as Patrick Brown has resurfaced or maybe never left. It's still a little unclear. So yesterday came out saying he was suing CTV over the report it put out near the end of January for defamation. But more interestingly, there's a story that was making the rounds this morning here that maybe he never actually signed the resignation letter and was technically still the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party.
So City News ran this story based on sources close to him, saying that he doesn't think the leadership race is valid and he didn't really resign. And that was weird.
He did a press conference where he said, I will be resigning, but he allegedly has not physically signed the document that is required for him to resign.
Well, not just allegedly. He has now come out and said it in another interview later this afternoon that I didn't sign that document. Well, I guess it's alleged in his words now. And that he didn't even see the letter his staff prepared. And City, of course, had to find some political strategist to be like, yep, that means he's still leader. And apparently City was also reporting that he's being encouraged to take his seat in the chair of the Leader of the Opposition when the legislature resumes on February 20th, which would be the most awkward start of a session.
Yeah, just him and Federelli like awkwardly staring at each other, and then the seat, and then each other, and then the seat. Trying
And
to
be
figure
very
out.
Canadian, be like, sorry, you're in my seat. Just very passive aggressive.
An interesting thing, and apparently, if I recall correctly, the PCs don't actually have a formal process to remove leaders, so a resignation is required.
Well, and as I tweeted out earlier today, I think the PCs forgot to invoke the rare no take backsies section of their constitution, which that's just a rookie mistake. But Brown tweeted out, I think trying to dispel some of this, that this story was just brought to my attention, referring to the first one from City News. He appreciates the enthusiasm, but he did not authorize this, probably meaning the
staff
sources
talking
going to them.
yeah.
And he's solely focused on clearing my name, not technicalities. You know, resigning from a party is a technicality, I guess. There was also briefly a report that he was thinking of putting his name into the leadership race.
Which would be interesting if he's still leader. Like, the whole thing is just, like, he's leader, but not... He's not leader, but leader, and then he's gonna run for the job he already had. Like, it's...
Well, and all this comes out after there was one or two minor details that turned out to be incorrect in the original CTV reporting. Like, one of the accusers said a door was closed, and he's like, there was never a door on that room.
There's a little more that was right. Like, I believe one of the accuser that was identified as underage turned out not to be, or so. Like, there's still other questionable behavior even in the corrected version, but, you know, I guess it's less bad.
It's a lot of stuff that seems like it can mostly be chalked up to the errors of human memory and the fallibility of human memory. So the fact that his entire senior staff resigned within minutes of hearing the story finally got out, and then the party pushed him out within an hour or two, leans credibility to the, yeah, everyone knew and just was waiting, not the people are trying to smear his good name.
Well, that has been the other theory that's flowed out, is that this was an internal party coup.
The inside job,
Yes.
The conspiracy theories. Well, and that's what Rebel Media is running with, so fun times in Ontario conservative politics with the clock ticking towards the next election.
Yeah, this is... They always manage to seem to screw this one up, but, like, this one is very impressive, because the last couple were... Okay, Tory screwed up on the faith schools thing, and that, yeah, bit him. And then the following one with Hudak, yeah, they, like, rolled out their campaign platform in a terrible way and never got off the first question people raised about it. But I think this one takes the cake for sheer dysfunction. And we'll just have to see, I guess, which one of the 4, possibly 5, now that Patrick Brown might be still running or not, or candidates ends up with the leadership at the end of all of this.
Assuming he doesn't sue and tie up the entire leadership process through the election and beyond.
I'm British Columbia, Victoria's my capital, Canada's westmost province, touching the Pacific.
And moving into the best of BC Poly for this week. Following the throne speech, there were a couple good tweets. First up, I saw at Tom Davidoff tweet hashtag throne speech. He was commenting on the government's first step must be to address the demand. Tom Davidoff tweets, Yowzer, stated preference for demand over supply action is noteworthy. Rich Coleman and Mike DeYoung must be rolling over in their semi-backbench.
And then there was Steve Burgess, who tweeted no major surprises in the hashtag throne speech. The acquisition of 50 F-22 Raptors from Lockheed Martin was perhaps a more aggressive move than expected, but times call for it. Hashtag BC Poly, hashtag AB Poly.
We'll need those in the ongoing trade war, and I am glad that our province has a better and more efficient procurement process than the federal government. It was also Valentine's Day this last week, and commenting on the trade war, the Dave Berta podcast at Dave Berta tweeted, Roses are red, pipelines aren't drippy, give us access to Tidewater, you ungrateful hippies. Hashtag not Lee Valentine.
And This isn't BC Poly related, but since we're talking Twitter, I do need to throw this in there that what is undoubtedly the best thing to happen on Twitter all week is Mr. T discovering curling and tweeting about it with the hashtag curling is cool, fool.
Make sure to nominate your favorite tweets for next week with hashtag best of BC Poly.
And that has been Politroast. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politroast.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitroastPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/Politroast. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.